Thank you, everyone. I'm always in awe of people who can talk without notes. I'm afraid I'm a note person. I don't have the memory for half an hour at all. So, yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. As I said, I'm a geographer at Birkbeck, University of London, and my interests are in anticipatory governance and survival subjectivities. So, as we've mentioned, preppers, also climate activists and off-gridders. And what I'll be presenting today on is the spatialities of denial and awakening. And it's intended to contribute to our wider understandings of how individually and collectively we respond to notions of the future as catastrophic. And how these catastrophic futures reside or hide in the present. So this is a future that, rather than being one of utopian technological promise and progress, is defined by the expectation of abrupt change, disruption, catastrophe. And this, as Eva Horn describes, has always been there as the underbelly of our modern visions of progressive futures. And we can, of course, talk of, trace a history of apocalyptic thinking and catastrophic imaginations. However, life in late modernity is diagnosed as thoroughly saturated by the normalization of apocalypticism, by ordinary slow crisis, slow catastrophe of precarity, and by routinized emergency. So as Wakefield asserts, the crisis is the age. Crisis defines the contemporary moment and is coupled by a future predictable only in its unpredictability, to quote Southwood. So crisis is therefore both routinized and so immanent, and unprecedented, so imminent. And this is a contradiction that Horn tries to resolve in the context of thinking about the climate catastrophe, as describing it as a catastrophe without an event. So concerns over catastrophic futures and issues of risk and insecurity permeate society and form a central way in which we are governed, to quote, distinctly writing the contours of our world. That's Amor. So the future is catastrophic, it's argued, is folded into the present, disrupting linear notions of time. Beck's characterization, as we know, of this period is of a world risk society in which catastrophic, incalculable, uninsurable risks proliferate out of control. And Beck points to the growing embeddedness of risk in public consciousness. Eamon describes the slow creep of fear, anxiety, and watchfulness into even the most intimate of spaces, here a bug-out bag, as the sense of the world and home at risk takes root. So crisis anxiety and a generalized insecurity emerge as a structure of feeling, an affective economy of fear that mediates how life is lived and thought. So given these depictions, if Beck's risk society is so preoccupied with risk, Norgod asks, why is this concern not more visible? To quote again Eva Horn, why does the awareness of an impending crisis go hand in hand with a remarkable inability to act, both politically and individually? We're on high alert, while also lame and indecisive, repeatedly conjuring up looming catastrophe and then immediately forgetting them. Barista, who's a psychosocial scholar from Birkbeck, refers to the disaster imminent in capitalism as the horrifying real, and considers how it functions as a signifier hidden in full view, something we know about, but simultaneously disavow. So these theorists have pointed to how populations in contemporary liberal democracies particularly appear to suffer widespread and structurally produced cognitive dissonance from crisis realities. So these are failures to form sufficient attachments to catastrophic futures folded into the present. It's failures of these folds to stick, to adhere completely in the present. So in recent years, there's, I'd argue, been a proliferation of calls to wake up to the reality of crisis, and notions of segments of society as sleeping or sleepwalking into crisis, or being lulled into a false sense of security, alongside references to awakening, being awakened. And this language, it seems, is increasingly mobilized to describe both individual and collective responses, particularly to the climate emergency, but also a wide range of other environmental, health and political crises. So it seems diverse publics and commentators are choosing to name or group experiences and shifting orientations to the crisis real as forms of awakening, whereas going about normal everyday life is sleeping in the face of this reality. So the language of awakenings is speaking to us as a meaningful descriptor of some sort of present experience. And this perhaps signals that we're at a moment of cultural and political unease, a critical juncture in, to quote from the historian McLaughlin's definition of collective awakenings, the legitimacy of our norms, the viability of our institutions, and the authority of our leaders. So I first became awakened to the significance of this metaphor, interested in it through my research with preppers in the UK. And it was a term from my interviewees that they used to describe their awakening stories. So these are the justificatory stories of revelation used to explain a person's journey into prepping. So Campbell and et al., who've also done research on prepping, describe prepping awakening narratives as, to quote, origin stories narrated as a road to Damascus moment, where the function of the event is to demonstrate how they were blind, working under false illusions, when something happens to expose the chasm that exists under this illusory veil. So these awakening narratives express an almost dislocating sense of the real, produced when an experience of exposure overlaps with places or situations that hold something of the familiar. So they capture an uncanny frisson, to quote Wiley, the moment at which the known abruptly seems unfamiliar and disturbing, the moment at which a sense of being at home in the world is existentially unsettled. So in the retelling of these diverse stories, they share the depiction of an affective, physiological and sometimes, or psychological and sometimes physiological jolt that changes the regime of visibility, the way the real is seen and understood, expressed as being suddenly awakened, having your eyes opened or a veil removed. So it was from this starting point that I've been nosing around, probing awakening and aligned notions of sleeping as a means to contribute to debates on detachment, denial and truncated agency in public responses to environmental crises. And awakening, I'd argue, becomes significant to the ways that we talk about and struggle to understand the coexistence of normal life and the climate crisis, as an example, as a deeply embedded denialism, such that living with climate change can be understood as living in a double reality. So my current obsession with notions of awakening and sleeping to describe widespread collective affective orientations to future catastrophe is related to a hunch around the significance of a contemporary crisis of reality, a geography of reality and unreality in understanding societal responses to catastrophic futures, and specifically this widespread inability to act. And my argument is that we talk about futures folded into the present as though this happens with ease, but we need to connect this future with awakening in order to understand how these futures manage or fail to become real and present, and so how these folds stick or fail to adhere. So I'm going to, after the sort of this disturbing talk about catastrophe, I'm going to intentionally put you to sleep for a bit, because in getting to grips with what is meant by this notion of the sleepwalking society, what is mobilized when we refer to people or populations as sleeping or sleepwalking in the face of catastrophe, we can look to shifting notions of denial. And I'm drawing here particularly on work on climate change denial. So in tracing a history of this work, we can see how explanations have developed from a geography of knowledge to the addition of a geography of emotions to the addition of a geography of reality, with this notion of sleeping, okay? So denial was initially defined through a straightforward concern for the transmission of knowledge about the future. A geography of knowledge, whether through the production, circulation and reception of information, or its spatial patterning across different types of lay publics, understood through a rational prism of possessing or not possessing the corrective information, of being wrong, so believing false knowledge or rejecting truth, or being ignorant, so not having received the right information, the right knowledge. And this placed individual cognitive frames as essential to explaining denial and inaction in the face of environmental crisis. And information deficit models, we know, giving attention to explicit climate misinformation, media distortion of information presentation, issues of distrust in scientists and politicians, and attention to strategies of how to better communicate the science and its urgency to the public. However, as Norgaard and Head in particular point to, studies have shown that knowing itself is not unproblematically related to concern or action to mitigate climate change, and that it doesn't account for the significant amount of people who do know enough about climate change, yet are still sleepwalking into catastrophe. So the question then becomes, how is it that knowing is not enough to promote significant action at individual and collective levels? And there have been two stages. I'll look at to this question. And on the one hand, there's leaving the knowing part unproblematized. Perhaps we just don't care. Perhaps the doom and gloom message itself promoted apathy or a sense of futility. Perhaps there are structural issues preventing us from acting on our knowledge and concern. Or on the other hand, the question of what it means to actually know has been open to analysis, with, to quote Norgaard, denial operating in the slippage zone between knowing and not knowing. Denial coming to describe a range of strategies that straddle the boundary between simultaneously knowing and not knowing. That's from Rowland. And then knowing can be far more ambiguous. We are vaguely aware of choosing not to look at the facts, but not quite conscious of just what it is we are evading. We know, but at the same time we don't know. One frequently mobilized example of this simultaneous knowing, not knowing, or partial knowing is the application of the work of the British sociologist Stanley Cohen to point to forms of interpretive and implicative denial, in which the facts of climate change, for example, might be accepted, but in ways that negates, alters the meaning, or renegotiates those impacts. Another example is from Lamb et al.'s work on discourses of delay, so discursive strategies of redirecting responsibility, emphasizing non-transformative incremental solutions, or the downsides of mitigating actions. So work in that domain is expanding the range of cognitive strategies drawn on to avoid the truth of climate crisis. And this development takes us closer to charting the new landscape of denial, this landscape of this sleepwalking society, through attention to geographies of affect and emotion, and the cartographic work done through structures of unfeeling that support this simultaneous knowing and not knowing. So denial, oh, golly, we're really, I'll do, has expanded beyond the rational weighing up of facts to become a deeply emotional, bodily, affective condition. Emotions are understood to operate as forms of effective labour that perpetuate a widespread appearance of unresponsiveness, indifference and inaction against crisis presence. And attention has particularly been paid to affects and emotions that involve displacement, detachment, muting, suppression, or a sidestep from reality. And this includes grief, sorrow, detachment, derangement, loss, but also optimism and, in some cases, hope. So Bissell, in a summary of work on anesthesia or unfeeling, names this as a crisis in perception. Unfeeling is described in spatial geographic terms as stepping outside a situation in space and time, which subsequently changes one's capacity to be affected by that situation. And Anderson explores the connection of unfeeling to non-events, considering when emergency events fail to move or fail to arouse concern or reaction, and the affective work that goes into making events non-present or not matter. And these include the collective emotional rules that mitigate feelings of fear and guilt, allowing social life to continue unperturbed. So, for example, Head considers how climate change can evoke such intense forms of emotional reactions, such as anxiety, grief, or dread, that the felt emotions themselves become numbing. And she explores how they may be compartmentalized in order to maintain efficiency. So, for example, as climate scientists. And then on the other hand, Berlant explores the way optimism effectively, masks or makes bearable the retraction of the promise of the good life, leaving the fantasy, so the unreality, the fantasy of upward mobility, job security, equality and intimacy intact as affective realism. So crucially, emotional denial has been expanded beyond the locus of the individual, shown to be collective, socio-culturally organised and reproduced, supported by wider cultural narratives. So these feeling rules form an affective structure produced as and through the everyday in ways that mask the cultural work it takes to uphold. So in pursuing this notion of anesthesia or unfeeling as a form of sleeping in the face of crisis, in the face of catastrophe, we move from affective structures and sociocultural narratives to the spatiality of emotional denial and environments of alternatively overwhelm and alienation that underpin not just anesthesia and detachment, but crucially also feelings of unreality. So to the geographies of knowledge and emotion, we're bringing in geographies of reality. So depictions of the modern world as overwhelming in its intensity emerged early on in Simmel's diagnosis of urban modernity disorientation, writing in 1903. So the cognitive and emotional overload suffered by early 20th century urban inhabitants in processing the dizzying intensification of urban sensory bombardment brought about through the new infrastructure of the everyday. So this shock on the collective sensorum suffered by new urban inhabitants produced feelings of the insubstantiality of the world. a reducing sense of solidity, of unreality, a form of ontological insecurity. So this picture of modern life as hypnotic, bedazzling, overwhelming in its excess, leading to a sense of unreality, and emotional dulling, detachment, or anesthesia, can be found across an array of theoretical approaches in the social sciences, exploring effective responses to aspects of late modernity, from Marxist false consciousness theory, perhaps, according to which mass culture overwhelms and brainwashes the proletariat, rendering them unable to see their own exploitation, to depict the overwhelming intensity of late modern work environments, which economic geographers, drawing on Foucauldian notions of the disciplinary management of space, argue produce a certain type of docile, acquiescent labouring body, enrolling bodies into a kind of cognitive automation through a sensory saturation of hyper stimulation, to draw on the work of Berardi. So, well, then alongside this, we have the overwhelming complexity of climate change itself, captured in Morton's concept of hyperobjects, to describe things that are impossible to properly comprehend or point to in their entirety. So this connects in a way to work also in wilderness studies, exploring notions of the sublime, the overwhelming awe felt contemplating the historical grandeur of the earth, and a sense of divinity and deep time. So overwhelm on the one hand, and on the other, depictions of distance and alienating environments. So alienation, the state of feeling estranged or separated from one's milieu, work, products of work or self, has of course also been a strong theme within different branches and theoretical histories of the social sciences. So from Weber's work on the alienating processes of the bureaucratic state, to more recently work exploring our alienation from the natural world. Harriet Buchaley writes about the elsewhere characteristics of the Anthropocene and climate change, and how its spatio-temporal framing has led us to discount its reality. So the natural or physical world, the argument goes, or as the environmentalist Bill McGibbon argues, is no longer as real to us as the economic world. Zizek writes, we may worry as much as we want about global realities, but it's capital that is the real in our lives. So whether overwhelmed through the hypnotic allure of everyday environments of intensity or precarious entrapment, or alienated and detached from nature and even ourselves, these accounts share the depiction of both crisis and the normal as taking on a sense of unreality, of the uncanny. And if we return to those forms of crisis sketched at the start of ordinary crisis, the routinization of emergency, the normalization of apocalypticism, this adds a crisis of the real as we probe these explanations for the sleepwalking society. Now, Norgaard suggests that the coexistence of the horrific reality of climate change with this collectively constructed sense of normal everyday life, this construction of non-crisis as normative realism, is such that we operate in this double reality, simultaneously knowing, but living as if it were not true, as if we don't know. To quote, just as social norms of attention create the sense of what is real, they also work to produce the sense of what is not real, what is excluded from the immediate experience of normal reality. This is not just separations on a plane of reality, but two different coexisting realities. So let me remind you again about those expressions of sleepwalking into crisis, of being lulled into a false sense of security. So denial as being asleep to reality, both produces but also allows for the coexistence of this double reality of future-present catastrophe through the flattening or spatial homogenizing effects of unfeeling, detachment, and anesthesia. So denial is akin to a survival strategy. We sleep because being awake is too frightening, disturbing, or difficult a position to inhabit, absorb, or integrate. We may be held in a condition of sleeping by late modern systems of modes of enrollment, distraction, repetitions, forms of insecurity, political systems, or environments of overwhelm, bedazzlement, or alienation. So, wake up. Let me briefly outline the coordinates of awakening. My argument is that awakening unveils this double reality of catastrophe and so resolves this sort of apparent failure of catastrophic futures to adhere in the present. What to say? The figurative use of awakening first entered the world's spiritual vocabulary, Cameron suggests, through the Buddha's statement that gave them their symbolic name, I am one who is awakened. And so awakening emerges as this liminal event between seeing and not seeing, a threshold between different perceptive and agental states, metaphorically differentiated as being asleep or awake, and a temporal threshold or meeting place between an unknowing past and a knowing future, incorporating an implicit hierarchy. And it now is used to name individual and collective moments of transition to heightened awareness and agency across spiritual, religious, political, environmental, cultural, and sexual fields. Awakening attains meaning through differentiation from a cluster of related concepts, conversion, enlightenment, revolution, renaissance, and resurgence, and in tension with opposing concepts, including cognitive dissonance, brainwashing, false consciousness. So looking across work from different domains and disciplinary cultures, there are significant shared features within a minimal general structure to awakening. And crucially, awakening is always narrated or experienced in relation to a socio-political field, situated within milieus with specific norms and modes of subjectification within which estrangement emerges. So awakenings point to a shift in existential awareness of a core reality concerning relations between the individual and the world. Clarke, for example, defines religious conversion as coming into an understanding of religious realities. Spiritual awakenings entail awareness of a spiritual meaning to life and a move closer to accessing the reality of existence. Now, there's a spatial inflection to this realization, a realization of distance from an ideal or a newly perceived reality. Political awakenings, such as the intellectual awakening on US Southern Black campuses of the 1960s, signal awareness of distance from civil rights and appropriate recognition in institutional forms. Brawl and Norgard suggest climate change as a cultural trauma, a systematic disruption of the cultural basis of a social order brought about through a realization of distance between the continuation of business as usual and the requirement for the severe dislocation of existing social practice. So this realization of distance within a newly perceived reality is a shifting structure of relationality in which the self does not remain unchanged. The remade self undergoes a shift in affective attunement, allowing the real to be sensed, perceived, and witnessed. And this can be experienced and expressed through sensual registers, likened to having been asleep in a dreamlike state of unreality and having a veil lifted, moving into the real, awake and aware. So awakening as a as a veil lifting, associates it in some ways with notions of the apocalypse, which in Greek means unveiling, a revealing of prophecies of the end of the world, an unveiling of previously unknown truths. So Horn writes of the revelatory character of the apocalypse, that what is revealed by the apocalypse is the true value and the power of everything and everyone. The end of the world is the unmasking of all things, the manifestation of their true essence. I like that moment in the apocalypse. So have I? I've argued, have I? Let's see. That it's not simply that through anticipatory practices that the future unfolds unproblematically into the present, but there are significant places where the folds sort of fail to adhere, where it peels back, leaving some spaces, material, sociocultural, conversational spaces enveloped in the horrifying real of imminent catastrophe, and others seemingly defined by the uncanny eeriness of the normal. And we can feel this uncanniness, this also there of catastrophe, overlaid on the normal, in those moments when going out normal life seems so at odds with the ongoing catastrophe that it takes on this. It's almost as though we're play acting, a normal life. It takes on these feelings of the unreality, taking your kids to school. For me, particularly going to the supermarket. So probing this a little bit, we can see that it isn't simply that the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed in terms of both knowledge of a future catastrophe, but also its present and future impacts. But that cognitive and affective structures of unfeeling or denial as survival, formed in and through emotional relations of overwhelm and alienation, produce and veil the double unreality of crisis and the normal. So just as there is no event for the non-engaged objective observer, it's the awakened to unveil and see this double reality, who can, as Richardson puts it, feel bodily the future in the present. It's the awakened anticipatory subjectivity, or collectively the awakened social movement, that attains a sort of hyper-attunement to spatial multiplicity produced through these crisis futures adhering in the present. And I think I'll leave it there. I've gone over time. Thank you.